Welcome to Food Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Atlas Fallen. I play on the PS5. It's also available on the Xbox Series X and Series S and PC. So, you play as an unnamed, which is literally a person without a name, and they're kind of like the lowest of the low in this society. While on an essence pilgrimage, basically you're attacked by these things called wraiths, which are sand monsters, and, you know, the military leader of the group, well, he just sucks. Basically, you're trying to bring everyone together, he's trying to rip everyone apart, and he kicks you out when you find a gauntlet of power that is possessed by an ancient god. With this gauntlet, you are basically the only person who can really combat the wraiths, but the dude's still a dick. You end up joining an opposition force, and that's kind of how the story really kicks off. And I gotta say, the story is, you know, nothing original in the slightest, and really they don't do anything to make it feel unique or super interesting, in my opinion. Not particularly interesting is, yeah, the best way I can describe the story. It really never did anything to draw me in. But let's get into the audio, and the first thing I'm going to say is, for whatever reason, the voiceover work for some of the side characters is superior to that of the main characters. A lot of the main characters, their voiceover work is adequate at best, but Niall, which is the god that is in the gauntlet, that talks to you. So if you're mad at Forspoken for having a talking cuff, you should be mad at this game for having a talking gauntlet, which being mad about is dumb either way, but the voice actor was basically reading a script and putting in minimal effort, and it really shows, especially since that's the voice you hear the most. But even your main characters, at best adequate, but generally pretty subpar in my opinion. As for the music, it's there, and it works, but again, totally adequate, nothing that you're going to remember down the line. And then last but not least, the sound effects. I think they do pretty good with the sound effects in like the desert environment, for the creatures, for the combat. I think all of that is well done. I did run into some times where there were missing sound effects, but overall, you know, it wasn't terrible. Let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and it's supposed to be an action role-playing game. I don't think it quite hits that. It also feels like a very entry-level Soulsborne, but I don't think it hits that either. As for the RPG elements, you collect essence, you pimp out your gear, and your essence stones, which enhance your abilities and whatnot, but there is no actual leveling of yourself. Your level is based on your armor and how much you've upgraded that, but that has caps. It's RPG-ish, but it's not like traditional RPG of leveling yourself up. Even Soulsborne games allow you to level yourself up. I say it doesn't quite hit the Soulsborne mark because while it does very much try to hit that gameplay, nothing just feels quite as good as it does in a well-done Soulsborne. Even like a more entry-level Soulsborne, it feels better. I can't quite pin it down, but while playing it, I always felt kind of disconnected from the combat, and it's hard to specify why I felt that way, but I did. And when you feel disconnected from the combat in a game where the combat is crucial and you can die so very easily, that's not a good thing. But there are certain things that I can pin down in the combat, and first off, aerial enemies. The game really isn't built around fighting aerial enemies, but they make you fight aerial enemies, and it just doesn't work. Getting close enough to them, jumping high enough to attack them, it runs into serious problems. But also, like, enemies are stuck to certain combat zones. You don't know where that combat zone is, so you could be fighting a big enemy, and a bunch of its, like, you know, add-ons, but oh, you fell out of the sky, or you were trying to get some space, and next thing you know, they all despawn, and you have to go back and restart that fight. Which, yeah, that can fuck all the way off. The other thing that can just fuck all the way off, like seriously fuck it and the horse it rode in on, is the lock-on system in this game. It's just fucking insane and does not work great. And that ties into the part where you can target enemy body parts, but just not in a good way because it doesn't cycle. So if you push up, you might get their head or another body part that's up, but if you want to go left or right, it might not cycle left or right. If you want to go down, you can go down, and that'll work. Like, the up and down lock-on works fine, but cycling through things does not work great, and it's partly based on camera position rather than like everything being labeled 1, 2, 3, 4 and cycling 1, 2, 3, 4. One enemy, I was locked onto his rear leg. I wanted to target one of the add-ons, so I pressed right, but the camera had shifted a little, and now I was locked onto his front leg, which was previously not right of the back leg, and it gets messy. Generally, when you successfully cycle to another enemy, it feels like more dumb luck than the system actually working. Now, mind you, this really only applies when enemies have multiple body parts to target. If you're up against like 5 just regular enemies, you can cycle through them fairly easily. But the whole body part system with the lock-on system just does not work well, but the lock-on system fails in other ways. The entire point of a lock-on system is to keep your camera locked onto that, and yet at times it would just kind of freely do whatever the fuck it wanted. The enemy that I'm trying to be locked onto would move to my left, right, and all the way behind me, and my camera would continue to face in front of me, and it wouldn't turn me with it, it wouldn't turn the camera with it, so that's obviously not helpful. But then other times it would work just fine and turn the camera and me and just work like a lock-on system should. But then there were also times where it would just disengage at random. I'm sitting there locked on and all of a sudden I'm not locked on and the enemy's moved and I'm swinging at fucking nothing. Completely useless when that happens. But then there are fights where that doesn't happen at all. Like I said, it's just inconsistent and it really damages the overall experience, especially when you're up against tougher enemies and you need to break down each body part. Although some dumb bullshit, when you destroy a body part, they can still attack you with that body part, so it doesn't make sense to have a body part based attack system. It really just overcomplicates the combat system and in a way that doesn't benefit the game in any way, shape, or form. I also definitely had issues with like hitbox sensing and whatnot because there were times where I was very clearly attacking and I should have been hitting them and it wasn't. There were times where enemies would do attacks that shouldn't hit me and they definitely hit me and it was just busted, and while you could eventually work your way around it and still succeed, it doesn't work as well as it needs to. To be a good, enjoyable game, in my opinion, it should really function far better than it did. I did like the sand gliding around the map. I thought that was fun. I thought a lot of the platforming was actually far better in this game than I was expecting it to be. But the problem is the combat sucks, so platforming around and exploring, while that is fun when you're engaging in the combat, it generally doesn't feel satisfying when you succeed because you failed so many times, not because it was tough but fair, but because the mechanics weren't what they should be. As I mentioned, it's not like as hard as, a Dark Souls, Bloodborne, etc. It's more of an entry-level kind of game, but you're still gonna die a lot if you're not used to that and you're not prepared for that initially, like I wasn't, which led to me dying quite a bit, and the load times in this game are awful. They are really bad. Now, as I mentioned, you do get things that you can kind of upgrade your moveset with, and you plug those in, which also can unlock some other special moves, which don't always work well. It's kind of ugly at times, and it's frustrating when these moves don't work for you. Like, when it comes to the gameplay, at best it reaches adequacy, but for the most part it felt subpar. Let's get into the controls, and same problem really, like at best they reach adequate, but I would say they're subpar, because I definitely had times where the game was not responding when I was doing something. I was definitely trying to roll, I was trying to block, I was trying to do whatever, and the game was like, nah, you didn't push that button. And I do understand that blocks in this game are very limited, but I didn't use them frequently. I tended to try and dodge more, but when I did try and use the block, it almost never worked. And there were times where I was dodging and it was just like, no, you didn't push that button. As for when you're controlling the camera, it works well. As for the movement, it could be a little cleaner, but overall it's good and it works well enough with the platforming in this game. The majority of the times, though, it did work, but you want your controls to work 100% of the time, and I didn't feel like they were. Then last but not least, the graphics and visuals, and it's not a bad looking game. This is definitely not a top tier game. It's definitely not AAA when it comes to the graphics. I do think the world that they built is pretty cool, being a desert and all. I think they did a lot with it. It being in a fantasy world, you have a lot of like just kind of crazy stuff and you can do some more interesting stuff, like with the weird rock formations that you get just out of nowhere in the desert. I think the armors are really cool in this game. I actually really liked the designs of them. Some of them feel a bit familiar but unique at the same time, which is awesome and enjoyable. I gotta say though, creature designs I wasn't too blown away with. I mean, they try and do what they can, but they're all these sand monsters, so they all have this bit of sameness to them, even if they are trying to make them very unique. But for whatever reason, I just didn't think the designs were that cool overall, and like I said, since they're all sand monsters, it's kind of like, you know. And I will say, some of the effects were pretty cool for your attacks, and for even some of the enemy attacks. They were really cool in the sand-based, making them like sandstorm stuff. When you're like sliding through the sand, because that's your speediest mode of transportation apart from fast travel. That all actually looks really cool, and the way it like blows around the sand, and just like I said, it looks neat. I think they did a good job with that. I'm not going to say that this game is like mind-blowing from the visual standpoint, but I do think they did a pretty cool job with a lot of elements of world building, but not necessarily the things you interact with the most. I did run into some weird graphical issues for sure though. Like every treasure chest I opened in the game would at some point in time while I'm looking at it just lose all of its texture. There's also an entire cutscene where there's dudes walking around with 2 tubes of like scrolls on his back, and they were just twitching around and spazzing out and warping about, and it was weird looking and, you know, just incredibly noticeable. Also, a weird visual choice, and I guess kind of a gameplay element, is you can choose your responses to conversations. I didn't notice that it mattered that much. But one weird thing is, like, your choice would just sit there on the screen while your character's saying it, and I just felt that that was unnecessary, and I think it would have cleaned things up a bit if they had removed that. But to wrap this up, I wanted to enjoy this game, I really did, but at the end of the day, it just felt subpar. Like, nothing in it was so terrible that I had a rage quit moment or anything along those lines. But at the same time, I feel like this game at its best reaches okay, but for the most part is pretty much subpar. And it's one of the games that makes me glad that physical media is still a thing, because I know I'm not going to get my full money back, but I'm definitely trading it in. I don't think it's worth picking up. I would recommend skipping it. Okay, in the comments down below, why don't you tell me what's your favorite game that's based in a desert world? And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.